One of the things that administration officials unbelievably leaked to the press was that they were worried that during the course of this temporary pause, journalists would be able to get into Gaza and people would be able to see the extent of the horrors and the carnage and the devastation that has already been wrought. And in fact, some of those images have emerged in the days of this temporary truce. Let's put this up on the screen. I mean, just unimaginable the level of destruction that you see in city after city. These places that we're showing you here are all in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Now, that doesn't mean the south has been safe, but the preponderance of the bombing campaign has been in northern Gaza, where Gaza City, which obviously is where the bulk of the population was, has been utterly destroyed, completely uninhabitable. Here you see a main road that is just littered with bodies strewn about the road, and horrific to see. Here you see, people gathered in the shadow of bombed out, destroyed buildings. And, in terms of northern Gaza, and this is coming out from, Gaza civilians, Palestinians who are trying to return home, there's nothing left. I mean, there are very few homes to return to in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. New York Times put together a piece just showing the historic level in modern times of this destruction and carnage. Put this up on the screen. So their headline is Gaza civilians under Israeli barrage are being killed at a historic pace. Even a conservative assessment of the reported Gaza casualty figures shows the death rate during Israel's assault has few precedents in this century. You can see this chart, leave this up on the screen, from when they started reporting the number of women and children who have been killed in this conflict. You can see how it makes up the overwhelming preponderance of the number of deaths. It's somewhere around 70% of the people killed by Israeli attacks here have been women and children. So even if you say everyone else, which is very generous, is a Hamas militant, you can see at the very least 70% of these deaths have come from women and from children. I encourage you to read this article to get a little bit of perspective on the scale and scope of this destruction in such a short period of time, in such a small area too, where people are packed in and they cannot, by and large, leave. More women and children have been reported killed in Gaza in less than 2 months than the roughly 7,700 civilians documented as killed by U.S. forces and their international allies in the first year of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And the number of women and children killed is starting to approach the roughly 12,400 civilians documented to have been killed by the U.S. and its allies in Afghanistan during nearly 20 years of war. So it gives you a sense of just, this is something different that we're seeing here. There is no comparison in terms of modern history of the amount of attacks on civilian infrastructure, the amount of women and children and civilians that are killed. And one of the things that struck me here, Saagar, that I thought you might pick up on because it's something we've been talking about is there are a lot of comparisons made to our campaign in Mosul. And they talk about how when we were in Mosul, we even thought 500-pound bombs were too much because it's this densely packed urban area. Well, Israel has been routinely dropping 2,000-pound bombs. Again, we said 500-pound bombs, that's too much. They're routinely dropping 2,000-pound bombs on what is one of the most densely packed parts of the entire world.
Yeah, actually, this is something I talked a lot about. If people are interested, I interviewed Jocko Willink. This is something I was trying to get at with him, which is the fundamental difference, I think, between the way that the U.S. and its partners operated in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially 2011 onward, and counter-ISIS campaigns in even in urban combat environments, versus the way that Israel has decided to conduct this war. One of the things that Jocko said, which actually really surprised me, is like, during the Battle of Ramadi, he's like, I think I called in maybe 5 airstrikes during my entire year. Well, all we did was he was like, we went in, we identified the target, we had our guys on the ground, and that obviously puts your troops at tremendous amounts of risk. That said, one of the things that U.S. commanders had a mandate for, even from that period forward, was we are minimizing civilian casualties because our purpose is to get the civilian populace on our side and to try and separate the terrorists from the overall civilian population. That's one of the other reasons. If you think, too, about the calculus of the bin Laden raid, the easiest thing to do for Osama bin Laden was drop a bunker buster bomb on his compound.
Yeah.
The reasons that we decided not to do that is, well, it's in Pakistan. You're not only going to kill every woman and child in the house, you're going to kill probably and flatten every single building around it.
Yep.
But it's not worth it because it would start an international incident and we would lose more high ground. And so we put our people in a tremendous amount of risk. And we sent them 160 miles in this territory to go kill, grab the body. And at the end of the day, you ended up killing people who had a weapon in their hand, and you were able to bring it back. I think that's one of the reasons why, if you look back on it, it's not only look back with such affection, in terms of finally getting the person who killed, who was responsible for 9/11, is that it didn't come with all of the attendant collateral damage and the drones that have ended up accidentally hitting a wedding and all these other stains on the U.S. campaign during terrorism. And this highlighted it actually to me the most, which is really the last time America conducted itself was during Vietnam. That was the last time that we did anything like this. And I think we all remember, and can even look at the idea that the entire idea behind the massive bombing campaign from Nixon to JFK, to Nixon to LBJ, was they were like, we can bomb these people into submission. And what they ultimately didn't understand is A, we were dealing with an ideological actor, and B, that they were just going to conduct guerrilla warfare and insurgency and outlast us the entire time. So that raises the question of Israel, what is your strategy? And this has been my fundamental, I think, criticism and departure from them is I have absolute sympathy, not even sympathy, I support the idea of killing every Hamas terrorist who was responsible for this attack. I even support dismantling the organization, but from day one, especially with a lot of their actions, it just remains questionable about what they want in the future. And I would, again, point people back to that Jocko interview, because one of the things that we really established, a big area between us, and subsequently in talking with Daryl Cooper at the Martyr Made podcast, is that we were like, there has to be a baseline level of trust from the civilian population for this to move forward. Because at the end of this, one day this bombing will end. One day it will end. And we have to think about what the end state of that is going to be. We can bomb for a month, we can bomb for 2, we could bomb for 20 years, as we all found out in Afghanistan. But if we don't have a sustainable political project at the core of that, something will crumble and will give ultimately. So in the interim, just thousands and thousands of people are dying. And I mean, you can't help on a human level but think about that as tragic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of new Hamas militants or other varieties of radicals that are being created by the horrors that are being inflicted on them, it's incalculable. So even if your only concern is long-term security for the people of Israel, then this has been a dramatic error and dramatic mistake. And, there have been a lot of Netanyahu has been making all these comparisons to World War II and, what about the bombing of Dresden? It was fine to kill civilians then. Well, there's a reason why after World War II, why we had the Geneva Conventions and why we said we can't have wars like this again. We have to put civilians and civilian infrastructure too off limits. And so, the basic job description for the soldier to make it, at its most basic element is to get the quote unquote bad guys and to protect the civilians. That is the job description. And yes, that comes at some risk. So it has been, it's been horrifying to watch what is unfolding there. And it's very hard to see what any sort of peaceful path forward from this moment is, even based on what's already been done. Even if they were to stop, even if they were to say now, permanent ceasefire, all right, we're done, that's it, we did enough in terms of Hamas, it's impossible to see what the path forward is from here.
That's actually my biggest fear is I'm like, you could even end it today. I'm like, but at this point, what are you guys going to do? Because as you laid out, at this point, we're in a middle ground strategy. I actually think they've basically boxed themselves into a corner where total war is their only strategy. One of the reasons why we had the bombings of Dresden and the fire bombings of Tokyo is, and people are interested, they should read Sean McKeegan's book called Stalin's War, where he argues vociferously against unconditional surrender against the Germans and against the Japanese. Controversial view, but the point that he makes is that it basically boxed us in from a tactical point of view where we're like, no, anything but the complete unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany and of Tokyo is acceptable, which means you can destroy 70% of their infrastructure and they still will fight because they're not going to capitulate. Now, it's a very controversial opinion, but I actually think he lays it out quite well. And one of the problems and fears I think I have here is at this point, you've destroyed Gaza City. It's a city of 1.1 million. Now what? You think you can just create some sort of political, small occupying force? Well, of course, what they want to do is ship all the Palestinians here. That's a more recent thing that they even laid out in the Wall Street Journal, shockingly enough. I'm talking about Israeli Knesset members. But let's put that aside and let's assume that their people are going to remain inside of this place. Well, what is the actual political project that you're pursuing? And I think, they've boxed themselves into a corner where total destruction, really, and then buying the future and hoping that the U.S. saves them in the future is probably the most likely path. Now, it's possible that we see some sort of resumption of the ceasefire negotiation, all that there isn't tons of international pressure, but I don't think so. If I had to bet, I would more likely bet on what the defense minister said, where he's like, yeah, we're at the very least going to see 2 months remaining of this type of campaign. But, I still come back to okay, but what happens the day after that? Are you just going to have a massive military presence inside Gaza or around it? Another thing for people who don't know, Israel called up 300,000 reservists. That is costing them $280 million per day. This could bankrupt the entire nation. Not alone, it's a small country, if anybody's ever been there. All the military-age males are now in the military. There's nobody working. Israel, one of their, I think, real claims is that they've built the first world nation and first world economy. First world economies don't run when all the military-age people are gone.
And not to mention, Palestinians have been banned from working in Israel.
Yes. Who often did the lower, lower
do
tier jobs.
The things that the Israelis didn't want to do. Anyone here in the U.S. will be familiar with the types of work that migrant laborers in our context does. So, and that's also why those Thai citizens were in Israel as well. Yep. But yeah, it's a huge economic hit. But I don't know if you saw this article, Saagar. Emily and I covered it while you were out about the quote unquote 3 options for the future. And one of them was push everybody into Egypt, the ethnic cleansing plan that we've been talking about, which is the option that, many ministers in the Likud party and other security cabinet ministers have been floating and framing it as humanitarian. They'll get to go wherever they want in the region. So there's that option. One of them, just to show you what a horrific situation this already is and how preposterous, they're like, we're going to build an artificial island like they do in Dubai.
Oh,
and
true.
and we'll
they
just give them new land.
Yeah.
They'll be totally on an island by themselves. And even in this report, which I think was, I want to say it was Times of Israel, but don't quote me on that. They're like, well, Gaza City is so bombed down, you can't even rebuild it. It'd be easier just to rebuild a totally new island. Which again, if you're talking about completely pushing 2.2 million people off of this little strip of land that you have, had imprisoned them in and had pushed them into already, well, there's a word for that as well. And it's not a pretty one. So in any case, those are the sorts of preposterous scenarios that they're floating right now. I think tomorrow we'll cover some of the way the U.S. is looking at this, the ideas of putting the Palestinian Authority in charge, which has its own problems as well. But, we're already at a place where, the largest city where over 1 million people lived has been completely destroyed. Taking out Al-Shifa was kind of like the last piece of taking out a core of Gaza Palestinian civilian life. You've already got 1.8 million Palestinians displaced. You already have at least 1 in every 56 Gazans either killed or injured. That's where we already are this very short time in terms of, how long wars normally go on into this conflict. As we have this very small pause and look towards what the future might be. I thought this piece from Haaretz, which by the way, Haaretz, under major assault from Israeli politicians as well, threatening to pull their support, et cetera, because they have done some actually good reporting during this war and in general do some good reporting. And we've framed them as sort of like the New York Times of Israel in terms of their political positioning. Put this up on the screen. They had a good report where they interviewed Palestinians about what this temporary ceasefire has meant for them. And the quote here in the headline, "Our lives have been destroyed. Temporary ceasefire offers little relief for Gazans mourning lost family and homes." They interviewed this woman, Isra, who's an English teacher. She's newlywed. And she said, listen, life doesn't go back to normal during a ceasefire. Only now do we realize the extent of the destruction. She goes on to say, I wish there were no ceasefire because basically now she has to see and come face to face with how much of her life has been destroyed and will never come back. She says it's apparently like the aftermath of an earthquake. Nothing remains as it was. What are we guilty of? Israel's problem is with the resistance, Hamas. Why hurt civilians? Our lives have been destroyed. Our families have been broken. There are no houses left, only stones. Another student in Gaza said, for Gazans, a 4-day ceasefire means looking for relatives to see if they're dead or alive. It's not just about getting food and water. The second priority is burying the dead and giving them their last respects. So that's the view from, inside the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, I encourage people to read that. As we said, it was actually reported by Haaretz, an Israeli media organization. And actually, it's funny, the more this continues, I look to them, the Times of Israel, even people inside of Israel, much more than I do to so many of our media. And we will give you a perfect view of why with the Fox News segment that's coming up.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.